Hello and welcome to this very special Eerie Extra. Eerie Extras is the place on Such a Nightmare where we put all the stuff that we just can't seem to fit into anywhere else. I am part of your Such a Nightmare team. My name is Katherine, and I'm so excited to get to be here today with Toni Tresca.
Howdy ho, buckaroos.
Well, that was intense. That was.
I'm trying a new thing. I was like, I'm gonna bring some energy. You were bringing some excitement. You didn't.
Yeah, it was not.
Well,
it was not where I hoped to go.
A note for next time.
So you and I were lucky enough that we got to sit down with some fantastic authors: Christopher O'Halloran, Antony Frost, Alex Wolfgang, Carson Winter, and talk to them about their book. And I realize it's backwards, the title, but Bloodlines. So it was just so wonderful. We had this conversation. It's not even been a week. It was this last weekend. And afterwards, you and I were like, what if we talked a little bit more about their fantastic anthology of 4 short story novelettes, however you kind of want to refer to them, because we didn't get a chance to just like gush too much because that's awkward. But like, I want to just talk about how great these stories are and how great it is to be having these writers creating this work in this moment.
Yeah, it was so great to get to sit down with, there are a bunch of indie horror writers who are they're just doing it because they love writing horror, and they love writing, and they love telling stories. And I think that is the thing that just elevated this anthology to just above just being, because anyone could put 4 short stories together around a central theme and like release an anthology. Mm-hmm. That's not that impressive intrinsically. What is impressive is just that it is clearly just made with so much love, and it tells you that right from the introduction, right from the like preface, introduction, dedication, in which they say explicitly, this book is dedicated to all the indie writers, the aspiring wordsmiths, the amateur storytellers. That's who we are. 4 dudes who met on the internet and threw a collection together around a common theme. Anyone can do it, really. That's 3 sentences. Now go write a book.
So nice. So inspiring.
And they did.
Yeah. So I was talking with someone about, somebody has taken the time to create, it's called like Horror Lex, and it is a database where you can enter or look up one of the films that they've entered into the database, and it'll tell you all the scholarship that's come out on that film. It's really lovely. And someone was asking, is there one for horror literature? And I told them, to the best of my knowledge, there's not, because there's just less scholarship written on horror literature, because for a very, very long time, you either treated horror literature as being Stephen King, or you were like, well, let's not talk about horror, let's talk about the Gothic. And because everyone else who was writing horror, it was being sort of pushed as like that trashy thing that you read alongside your romance novels that you quote don't tell anyone about. But what's great about Bloodlines and what's great about this current moment is that we can have indie writers who are really talented, who have important things to say, and because we've begun to remove that stigma of self-publishing, right? We can have 4 indie writers who said, we sat together and did this. Now it's your turn. Let us know so we can buy your book, right?
Yes, and I love that. That was the dynamic that I got from just like speaking with them in the interview. They were just they were so willing to shout out other horror authors besides themselves. And it's clear, one of the things we like, I enjoy talking with you because we read a lot of horror.
Yeah.
We read a lot of horror. We watch a lot of horror. And so did they. Yes. And it was so refreshing to get to talk to writers who were fans of the genre. Because a lot of times we talk about, like, it feels like in horror films, it's made by people who don't even really like horror that much. Yeah. It's made by people who are like, oh, this is cheap to make, and we can sell it really easily and make a profit.
Yes. And
so that's why we do horror, and we love horror for that. But these guys just really, I don't know.
Yeah, and they're current on contemporary writers, which is something you said that's very important, because the other thing, right, is if you talk to filmmakers or some writers, even if they don't seem to like actively not like the genre, their examples are just the same sort of canonical people. And that's great. Right. There's a reason that people become canon, but there's also a reason that canon should be the first, but definitely not the last step that one takes into a genre. And so they're like, hey, have you been checking out these new voices? And we even get a reminder that horror is kind of for everyone in the introduction.
Yeah, there's this fantastic foreword written by Solomon Forse, where he just kind of like talks about these horror, introduces it from like a really domestic point of view. Just like, isn't it scary when you slept over at like a friend's sleepover? Weren't you really terrified of that? And they're like, well, sit with that feeling.
Yeah. That's
the feeling we're going to be with for the rest of this book. And they include this really fascinating description of horror. A lot of our conversations evolve around genre, definitions of horror, what makes good horror. And this has it doesn't have exactly a full answer, but it has the beginning of what horror does best. Mm-hmm. They say, what is horror but a violation of reality? And if that core of horror is a violation of reality, what's more real to us than our family, our home, the rules and roles of the miniature kingdom we have known since birth?
Yes.
And so and that's what all four of these stories are. They're violations of reality around the family unit.
Yes. And
very different family units, but
yes,
family units nonetheless.
And before we talk about the four stories, I want to spend a moment longer on the forward for two reasons. One, I appreciated his reference to books that were similar to the ones that I read when I was little, that like on the surface are not scary, right? Like Sesame Street books. But, yes. There's a very famous Sesame Street book with Grover that's, there's a monster at the end of this book. And I remember even before I understood that I liked horror, right? Like I kept coming back to that book and I would always ask to have that book be read to me. So there's this really interesting way in which, he's reminding us that for many of us, horror has been a part of our world before we ever sat down with something that like might be recognized officially as horror. And then
exactly
again, that reference that he has about, having gone in and slept over at someone else's house, he put into words what I could never quite understand as a kid. And that was why I found it so uncomfortable sometimes to spend the night at people's houses. And it was because I never knew, was I following the rhythms correctly? There's always the things that like some houses, it was like, you're not allowed to drink or eat this. And I was like, well, in my house, we do that all the time, and it was like, and I don't understand. And that's a lot to put on like a kid,
a child.
Yeah. Like if you think about it, sleepovers might be the most like barbaric thing we can do to children. But Forse is reminding us, right, that like horror really is about the family, either being with a family or being away from a family, that, are like intimate horrors that we experience and frame the world through are ones that are familial, which is where, again, this collection is going.
And I think one of the themes that emerges from these collections, these four stories, is just how much of it's violation of reality, but also a tacit acknowledgement that reality is insanely constructed and individualistic to each person. And so that what that violation looks like is entirely dependent on what your preconceived notions about what reality is.
Yes.
And so like in many ways, that example of the sleepover is a perfect example of that. It's so brilliant. So simple, but so brilliant, because it's like, it is your limited view of reality is being challenged by someone else's view of reality in a very tangible, real way.
And we continue to experience that trauma, if you will, through our entire lives. Because if you end up having a significant other, you're going to have to figure out how to take the family that you grew up with, for better or worse, and the family they grew up with, for better or worse, and then make a new family, right? And it could be something silly, like, do you open presents on Christmas Eve or on Christmas Day and one of you is wrong, right? It could be something silly like that. Or it could be something fundamentally intense, like, I didn't realize until we got married that the way my family processed love was not as functional or good as it could have been. I just never realized that. I've heard lots of people say that, where they'll be like, my partner opened my eyes to what it meant to have unconditional love for the first time. So like, it's a lifelong trauma. And the first story really shows us how lingering trauma can be, even after, a family member may be gone. And that's Christopher O'Halloran's story, Our Migraine.
Yeah, this was a very haunting tale. It's these three sisters are, after their mom, they wish for their mom's pain to be removed from them when she is dying and is in this increasing pain. And one of the sisters, Penny, even directly states that she wants to feel that. She wants that. She wants to take on this disease. And the universe listens. It breaks reality, and it gives these three sisters the ability to take on the migraine.
Yes.
And pass it between. Only one person could have the migraine at a time, and it's incredibly painful, so they have to take turns passing it between each other. Yes. And that concept alone, like if anyone, my partner suffers from migraines.
I have migraines.
I've like seen how bad a migraine can get, and so imagining just that willing passing of it back and forth is just so hard to read.
Yes. And O'Halloran does a really good job of creating, like, reading it, I could feel sort of phantom migraine symptoms because, he really did a good job of touching on what it feels like physiologically. So we have the physical body horror, but then, of course, we have, the horror of and we'll let you read the story because, like, everyone needs to go out and buy this book. But like, what happens if you're like, well, maybe I don't want to be in pain for a little while. Maybe I want to be selfish. And what's so fascinating about this is a lot of horror will do this, like, at what point do you stop being altruistic? At what point do you stop being a good person? But few stories ask you that with family members, right? Often it's like, would you save a stranger? Like the premise of much of the Saw franchise where it's like, you could save this random person who's in the other room, or you could save yourself. And it's like, well, we know where most people are going to go. But this story asks us, when does family become a burden, and when does it become a savior? And when are you willing to say that family is not as important as me, but family is also who I am, right? Like, there's a lot to unpack in all of that. And O'Halloran gives it to us in a really haunting way.
Yeah, you're like, at a certain point, you're like, maybe my family's suffering. It doesn't need to be my suffering.
Yes.
And that is the idea that they're working with, O'Halloran is working with in that central story. And the repercussions from denying the suffering are horrifying, to say the least.
Yes. So we go from this very contained, the entire thing happens within the same apartment space. It feels very intimate, to the story by Antony Frost, which is called Nos Da Tad, which translates to Good Night Dad in Welsh. And we've now expanded it out. So instead of it being intimate of, these are my sisters that I've been living with literally for years. And
that whole thing is, the migraine takes place in that apartment.
Exactly.
It does not leave that one room the entire story.
Exactly. Instead, now we're in a bigger place, right? Because someone finds out that their deadbeat dad that they only share a name with and some DNA has bequeathed them a house, and they don't know if they want it, right? So again, we have that, like, right. At what point are we required to accept the, quote, gifts and often burdens that our families put on us? But Frost, and you can hear this in the interview, is really interested in thinking about bigger things, of hierarchies. So there's the fear of self, but also the fear of the like, shadowy, potential underworldy stuff. And we get to see that.
Yeah. And the unintentional consequences of our actions.
Yes.
Because this story is just filled with characters making decisions that upon first pass, or even like your first read, you're like, absolutely, 100% logical, I see why you make that decision. But by the end of it, pun intended, it spirals so out of control, and that's a pun perhaps for maybe only people once you get to the end of the short story. But it spirals so out of control, and there were so many unintended consequences because the situation that is presented in this, while on first glance seems very straightforward.
Yes.
Go recover the house that my dad is now dead. I've got to do that. But by the end, it has devolved into this otherworldly, vast conspiracy that, upon first glance, you could never have guessed that there were gonna be those consequences.
And the story navigates in really powerful ways, while also adding this huge other element, the concept of found family, right? And the significance of having people that matter to you because you matter to them, and at what point, at what point is family something that is biological, and at what point is it so much more than that? And Frost refuses to make it really easy, right? He's like, well, it's kind of complicated because biology is legit, but so is emotion, and we can't separate them because we are biologically emotional creatures. So there's just really some fascinating levels that he's built into how we have to think about family.
Yeah. And the expectations of family and those weird pressures are the themes of the next short story, written by Carson Winter, I Am Not to Be Replaced, which kind of zones in on what happens when your actions are not to the approval of the rest of your family, and then they decide to do something about it.
Yeah.
They replace you with a better version, quotation marks, obviously, without the defects that the family has deemed you have. And it follows this young girl who has been replaced by her family, and is now stuck as a ghost watching them at this cabin.
And the first person narration really was the perfect choice for this. Not only because the main character can't, talk to the other people, but also because one of the big themes of this story, and again, like you said, it builds so perfectly on where we've been with the other two, is it possible that being with people that you hate but know could be better than being completely alone, right? And like, I've had these conversations before where people have been like, but why do you still interact with this person? Or how come you still consider them to be important in your life, even though you haven't talked to them for months or years? And I'm like, because they're family. And it's complicated. And I think that the short story reminds us of that by asking us to put ourselves in her shoes, right? And we see that, like, she really can't stand her family. Why should she? They've literally replaced her. But also, she's been alone in a way that, like, none of us can really even fathom levels of alone. And that has been a worse hell for her in many respects.
It has, but then she doesn't exactly want to go back to her family either. She's, again, obviously, she had been deemed not successful enough. I thought it was particularly very interesting, like, she had been just kind of like a lot more of a boisterous person who was going down a more humanities career track, and was just deemed not submissive enough to fit into the family structure. So they kill her, turn her into a ghost, and replace her with this docile, submissive, engineering major daughter, who fits in and plays the role that the rest of the family wants him to play. And I think that's one of the things that I found so interesting about it, is this idea of so much of family units are just a series of roles and expectations that other people pass down and project onto you. Yes. And then when you don't meet those expectations, they feel weird about it for reasons they don't even understand. And in this book, it's like, well, what if they did something about that?
And being at a university like I am, and like you've been for so long, it's the number of times that I hear, but that's not what my parents want me to do, right? And that's just how it is. Or sorry, my phone is ringing. I'm just gonna hang up on that. So since we're doing this live, that's just how it works. Welcome to reality.
Welcome to reality. That phone broke our reality that we had all agreed on. So in essence, it's just another it's just another way it ties into this.
It's a family moment. So there's an element in which the story has this sort of like conversion therapy layer, right? And of course our main character isn't mentioned as being gay, nor is her brother, who's also been found deficient, although he's the way that he's described has some things that people often code as being gay. But that thread, that like awareness that we do this all the time in real life, just makes this story particularly haunting. And then of course there's our final story.
The Heads of the Leviathan by Alex Wolfgang. This is perhaps the most distant from the rest of the family units. It's on a separate island, far removed from the outside world. And it follows this family that, upon the death of their mother, they kind of realize that maybe they're connected in a way that maybe their mom had not told them.
Yes.
100%. And so it's kind of dealing with the, our family's got secrets, and they're going to affect you in ways that you have no idea about until it's happening.
Yes. And so we have this story that's asking us, at what point does our family literally become our entire world? Where do we separate ourselves from our family? And where do we realize that, like, we are the product and maybe even the, like, the sum of the parts, right? Like, so a family is simultaneously individuals, but it is also greater than those individual components. And then there's just a sort of like cosmic layer of horror, as you might guess from the word Leviathan in there, that makes it so that as you're reading the story and you're reading this main character struggling to understand, like, why didn't his mom tell him things? Why didn't she prepare him for things? And there's kind of that like awareness of like, but how many times have we not listened to our parents, even when they were like, hey, maybe you shouldn't do this. And we're like, I know what I'm doing. I'm 14 years old, So there's just, it's a hard balance to strike, but Wolfgang managed to create something that doesn't feel at all like anything I've ever gone through. But there are these moments that I can identify with very sharply, and very, very real. It feels very real in so many ways.
Well, I think this is perhaps, along with, I guess, Antony Frost's story as well, the most abstraction it requires, because it's the themes and the messages are buried within all of these other larger situations that are going on, cosmic, as you mentioned, seem kind of maybe apocalyptic as well, getting that vibe from this. And so, yeah, it's really interesting, the truth that's able to come out of that abstraction, though.
And there's this element that I think, again, I have not encountered a Leviathan to the best of my knowledge in real life, but
neither have I.
Good to know. But the thing that is very relatable is this narrative of loss of when a parent dies and you realize all the things they never told you about them, about you, and sort of like also just if you have siblings, it seems like there's always inevitably that struggle of, but like, who's in charge of putting together our lives now, and who has been given the task of like being, for example, executor of the estate, and then like people wanting it but not wanting the responsibility. And so again, this story manages to take these really, like you said, abstract and wild things that are not going to happen to most people, and it still makes it feel like it is a story of, as the subtitle says, familial fear, right?
Right.
Because it is, again, bloodlines, and it's going back to that.
So those are all 4 stories in here. They're very, very different from one another, and yet they still have that through line that connects all 4 of them together. And yeah, I just want to say I really, really enjoyed these short stories. Short stories are very difficult for me. I think that I often would just rather read the full novel with them. It's hard for me to sometimes justify being like, that all of these needed to be a short story. It's like, either it's not enough there, so it should have just been like a couple of pages and like a really short, or it needed to be, I needed more. But all of these fit like I think that they do the short story format really well, because they are just small enough stories that the shortness of them makes sense while still packing in so much goodness within their form.
Right, and they talked about the fact that a couple of these stories were hard to place for that very reason, right? Because they're not quite, they're definitely not novel length. They're not even quite novella length, but they're like novelette / really long short stories. And I think at the end of the day, one of the things that makes this series, this book, the series of stories so good, is that, like a family, it really is that, the sum is greater than the individual parts. Each story is really powerful and moving, but when you read them together and you have to like take a step back and see that bigger, again, to bloodline, right? That to have that pie.
Yeah.
You can't help but be reminded that family is so complicated. Of course it's going to be horrific, because how can we understand something that is itself both incredibly intimate and familiar, but also kind of cosmic, right? And that's just really great.
Yeah, and so anyone who's reading it, wants to read it, I definitely recommend checking it out. And don't skip the foreword either.
Yes.
It is, I think, so powerful in helping tie these things all together. And just that author who wrote the foreword had some really fascinating insights into the world of horror and in context of these short stories that I think really helped contextualize and really helped me appreciate the connection of them all, even when they are so very, very different from one another.
So you should buy this book. You should leave a review, because these authors, you know, they're real people and they're really invested in the horror community. You should watch the interview, because they also have recommendations of the horror that they're engaging with, as well as just them sort of unpacking what horror means for them, and listening to their interview enriched my reading experience, you know, just exponentially.
Absolutely.
We would love to hear from you. What are your thoughts about Bloodlines? What are the books that are coming out that are indie, that are fresh, that are new, that you want us to talk about? Anthony, before we quickly wrap up, what else do they maybe need to know?
You can follow us on all of our social medias, which are in the description of this video and /podcast. You can also get in touch with us via email. Let us know what you want to see next, what you like, what you disagree with. We want to hear it all. And if you have time, please consider giving us a rating wherever you get your podcasts from. It helps give us exposure and help us have more conversations with more people about horror.
Exactly. Thank you so much for listening to our nightmares.
And have a spooktacular day.